Well, hello and welcome to our first video for beginners. In this video, we're going to learn how to become a pro as a beginner. I'm going to share with you some tips and tricks that you can learn to perfect your craft instead of going over and researching and trying to figure things out along the way. In this video, we're going to talk about the sewing machines and which sewing machine you should have and use. We're going to go through threads, needles, and fabrications. I'm going to show you some techniques on how to do a straight stitch and much more. So let's get started and I'll see you in the next segment. Okay. So first I want to talk about the sewing machine. The sewing machine does not determine the level of skill that you have. The sewing machine just enables you to do your tasks much easier, but does not determine the quality of work that you put out. You as a seamstress, designer, sewer determines the craftsmanship off of your own skills. Your machine does help you with your tasks to make it much easier. I was working with an older machine for a while, and then after a while the machine started to slow down, which slowed down my work. So now I need a newer machine to help me move quickly with my projects. So I want you to keep that in mind when you go in and looking for sewing machines and you're trying to figure out which one I should get. Just get a sewing machine that is useful for your tasks to get your tasks done. But at the end of the day, no matter how fancy your machines are, your quality of work determines on your skill level, not your machine, because nobody can see your machine after your work is done. Okay, so here's my sewing machine that I currently work on. It's a newer model. It's just a regular home sewing machine. It has 3 dials at the top, a turn back button, foot pedal, a dial to manually turn your needle, and thread position. And also I have a serger machine. And I think these two machines are very important to use when you first start. It gives you a professional finish. So here's my home machine, and I'm going to basically show you the place where you thread. And every machine has their own version of threading. So I would recommend you to go and review your manual book to see how to thread your machine. Here's my foot pedal. And down here is where the bobbin case is. Make sure your bobbin case is very clean and clear so that way you can work very efficient and easy so nothing gets caught in the way of the bobbin area. Foot pedals. There are many foot pedals, but these are two main pedals that I work with. And this is the main one that I use, that I do bulk of my sewing. And it does straight stitches, embroidery stitch, and zigzag stitch. Another foot pedal that I use a lot is a zipper foot. As you can see, the zipper pedal foot is much narrow than the standard pedal foot. I use my zipper foot for installing invisible zippers or regular zippers, or use it for narrow space tasks that the wider foot cannot reach. Also, your machine may come with novelty pedal foots. This one is a buttonhole that came with my machine. As you can see, it's a longer foot for the length of buttonhole that you want to create. But if your machine did not come with one, you want to research your model to see if it's available. The zipper foot has a right side and a left side, and it could be interchangeable for the task that I'm working on. So I think these both pedal foots are very important to use as a beginner. Depending on the task and project that you're working on, there are multiple foot pedals available for your machine. You would just have to research to see what are available and see if your local fabric store carries them. Needles. Needles are very important when it comes to sewing per fabric. Usually, once you get very comfortable with the machine, once again, you can kind of decide which needle will work for what fabric, even if it's stretch or non-stretch. But when you first start, you want to have like needles that are designed for that fabric. This is a needle that's universal for my machine, for my Singer machine. You will have to research the needles for your machine. And this needle here is designed for knits, and it shows you down the bottom. And there's a smaller head and a more bigger head. And for you to decide which needle is more thicker than the other is by the number of the needle size. So this is obviously for maybe medium to lightweight knits. And Here is a set of woven needles. These are for non-stretch fabrics. It goes from light tissue weight to heavy weight. Here in this set, it shows 116 as the heaviest, but there's heavier. There's 118, and I use that for heavy duty. Also, there's universal needles, and these needles, I guess they're designed for any machine. I'm not too big of a fan of them because sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But I do use them as emergency purposes. But they do have numbers as well, as you can see the size of the needles. And they come in a packet like this, and they have like about maybe 10 needles on the inside of the packet. And you just basically use them like you would use for the needles in your machine. They have a number that's written on the outside edge of the needle, which you can see there's a flat side and a round side, and on the rounded side you'll see where the number is printed on the needle. That is where you can tell the size of the needle, and then you can install it by just, if you have a screw or needs a screwdriver, you can unscrew the needle at the foot of your machine and just pull out the old needle that's probably broken, or you want to change out the size, and just replace it with the new needle. And again, you just want to fit it in the space where the flat back sits in properly, where it goes in and locks in. That most likely is be towards the back of the foot pedal, and you just screw it back into place. Threads is also an important thing too when it comes to sewing. I usually mostly use polyester thread. That's usually what I use for bulk of my stitching, my sewing projects and everything like that. So as a beginner, you can use the poly thread as well. Some poly threads are very linty and some of them are not. I think the ones that are not linty probably is blend with something else, but for the most part, it does get very linty, but they do last for a very long time, and it's very accessible for you to find in any fabric stores. When you start looking for special threads, it becomes very hard to look for, and especially when it comes to colors and you matching the fabric, that can be a problem too if you have a special thread. But poly is usually all over the place, and as you can see, this thread here is a bit more lintier than the other one, so depending on the threads, when you look for the quality, just look for one that's less linty. This is a heavy duty thread. It's also polyester, but it's a better quality. As you can see, it's not as linty as the other qualities thread I showed you before, and this is used for like heavy duty stitching on denim, coats, buttonholes. Depending on the level of workmanship, there are people who hand stitch their buttonholes, and they use these heavy duty threads to really enforce the buttonhole to make it last longer. So they hand stitch the buttonhole instead of doing it in the machine. You can find these threads in your local fabric store. They're usually on a rack or on a display case like this one, as you can see. And this thread does not come a lot on the spool, so it's a little bit more pricier because the quality is much better. This is a transparent thread, and this is used for embroidery, beadwork. This thread is not as heavy, but if it's not threaded properly, it can loosen. So there's a special way to use this thread, but it's also used for beadwork and handwork. Stitches. My machine has several different types of stitches for embroidery, zigzag, and straight stitch, and so on and so forth. And I think there's a stretch version and for the woven version. Now the dials on top of my machine is to able to do and use all those stitches. Your machine could be different, so you want to go and refer back to your manual to see what you can do with your machine. The tension dial that I use on my machine, I use it to do gathers. Here is a demo where I'm gathering it up just in case for my gather projects, and you can use that too when you're gathering and making gathers. The greater the number of the tension, the tighter the gathers will be. The lower number of the tension, the looser the gathers will be. For the stitch width dial, I just use it to adjust my needle position, and I also use it to determine the width of my zigzag stitch. If I want a more narrow zigzag stitch, the lower the number. If I want a wider zigzag stitch, the higher the number. The stitch length dial is the distance between each stitch. For a looser straight stitch, the higher the number. A more tighter smaller stitch distance, the lower the number. Same thing with the zigzag. It'll become a bigger zigzag stitch. If I want a tighter zigzag stitch, I'll go down on the number. Dial behind the machine is for me to be able to switch into different stitches. I really don't use the embroidery stitch too much because I don't do embroidery, but maybe in the future I probably will. But I mostly use the straight stitch and the zigzag stitch. So as a beginner, those are two of your main stitches that you will be using. Now, the overlock machine, I think is very important for you to have an overlock machine because it showcases that you are professional and you're taking your work very seriously. The overlock machine is being used in a lot of stuff that you have that we currently use and wear when we purchase at the store, and they use a lot of that in high end as well. And this kind of determines the level of work or quality that you offer for your work. People recognize this stitch. Even people who don't even understand sewing knows that this stitch means that it's professional. It came from like a factory or something like that. So you want to have something that basically speaks of that level so people can respect your work. I mean, people usually finish their edges with pinking shears and zigzag stitches, but at the end of the day, it kind of reminds them of homemade stuff and not pro stuff. So if I were you, I would invest in a overlock machine. My overlock machine is a Singer as well, and each thread is threaded through each separate dial into an area down below the machine there, and then it goes into the needle area, and then back here is basically for the gauges and how much of thread you want to use and the sizing, and then here is where the scissor cuts the fabric and how far out you want to cut your edge, and then the final dial at the bottom where the black dial is just to adjust the width of the stitches. The overlock machine can be very complicated if you don't know how to properly thread it, because if you don't thread it properly, it won't stitch. I would recommend you to review your manual that came with the machine so you know exactly how to properly thread the machine. Scissors. Having a good pair of shears is very important. I have different type of scissors that I use for different type of fabrics, and I like to keep them separate because I don't want my scissors to get dull. One fabric scissors cannot do every single task and cut every single fabric, and certain fabrics might dull the scissors, so I want to keep my scissors separated. So you can do that if you want to, but at the beginning you're probably not gonna know until you start seeing and working with scissors. But I do recommend to have certain scissors for certain fabrics, like my sequins or novelty fabrics that has metal or any type of beading. I use my heavy duty scissors to cut those type of fabric, and I keep them for that type of fabric because I don't want them to get dull. My other fabric scissors, like my regular pink ones, I use it for medium weight like Ponte, lightweight wools, medium weight fabric like satin and knit stretch fabrics. I use it for that, and I keep it for that only. Now this is a pair of pinking shears, and like I said in the beginning, people use the pinking shears just to not fray the edges of their fabric. But again, this is very amateur-ish. They do used to use them a long time ago in certain garments, like in jackets and stuff, but that's inside before they fully line them. But these days I don't think they use the pinking shears anymore. So you can use that for now, but if you really want to take your work serious or want people to take your work serious, I do recommend the overlock machine. My next scissors is for paper. Paper scissors always cut only paper and nothing else but paper, and I use that for my pattern making. The last one is a rotary cutter. The rotary cutter, you have to get a good one, but sometimes it can get in the way when you're using your tasks. As a beginner, you could use it. I think it's good for certain things, but after a while it's not the best thing to use besides a good pair of shears. So here I have Ponte, a knit Ponte, and when you're going to cut fabric, you want to make sure your scissor bottom is on the table flat or on the surface, on a flat surface. Do not lift the scissors up when you're about to cut, because that way you can cut a straight edge. As you can see how I cut, I make sure the scissors on the surface flat, and I'm just going to cut into it. You want to make sure your edge is nice and neat so that way you can evenly put them together before you stitch. A jagged edge will give you a jagged edge stitch and it's not going to be accurate. So you want to make sure your edges are very clean when it comes to cutting, and making sure your scissors cut through the fabric very nicely and clean. Okay, so I have a pinking shears. Like I said, I don't use the pinking shears too much anymore. This is very dull now, so I'm probably going to use it for paper. So you want to have a pinking shears that's very sharp. And the pinking shears is just to clean the edges without causing the fabric to fray. It's going to give you a zigzag edge. But with the pinking shears, if you're not neat, it will be jagged and you won't have a straight edge. So no matter, even if you're using a pinking shears, try to keep your edges very straight, so that way when you're going to match up with the other end of your fabric to sew seam allowance or sew things together, you want to make sure that the seam allowance is even, so that way your stitch can be straight. So here I'm having a little trouble with the jagged edge, but I did it as straight as possible. My paper scissors are for my pattern paper. As you can see, I just cut across the pattern paper. The pattern paper has inches and boxes, so it's easy to follow. Here is the rotary cutter, and the rotary cutter requires a cutting mat. There are tables that are made with the cutting mat, so if you are able to purchase a table, you can get a good rotary cutter to help cut your task. A good rotary cutter will cut your fabric very nice and even, and you don't have to really like move around too much. It's very easy. But again, if you don't have this cutting table or cutting mat, it will be very difficult for you to cut it on regular table. You don't want to cut it on paper because it will cut through your fabric onto paper and it becomes a mess. So I try to stay away from the rotary cutter and just cut with scissors. But if you prefer the rotary cutter, you will need a cutting mat or a cutting table to use it. Here's a demo of me using the rotary cutter. This rotary cutter is not so great. It's not as sharp, so it's kind of giving me a hard time to cut. But if you have a good pair of rotary cutter, it will help you create a nice clean edge when it comes to cutting your patterns out. So here I'm just going to take my scissors and just, cut away the pattern out of the circle. But as you can see, it's a clean cut for the most part. These are our most important cutting tools. Depending on you and your task and how well you use your cutting tools, you'll decide which one is best for you. Sewing tools. There are several sewing tools that you're going to be needing in the beginning. Here's a small cutting scissors. I don't know what these are called, but they are very handy when you're cutting thread. Your machine may be able to cut your thread once you finish stitching, but if you don't have a machine that cuts for you, you can use this to help cut. You're definitely going to need a seam ripper for your seam ripping task. Sometimes you're stitching something and it didn't come out right, so you have to take it apart, or it's just like you have to take apart an item that you put together or alterating. It's very important to have. Pins and needles are very important if you're doing handwork. If you're putting fabric together, they're coming handy. These small scissors are very, very good too when it comes to like cutting away small tasks that the big scissor head can't get to, or it's very annoying. So the little scissors can help with like little dainty work that you're going to be doing by hand. I have a lot of bobbins because I don't have time to unthread a bobbin to rethread it with a new color. No thank you. So I go ahead and buy a bunch of bobbins so that way I can thread them up in the color that I'm going to be working with for my projects. So I recommend a lot of bobbins. Rulers are another essential that you're going to need. Here I have a curve ruler. The curve ruler has a armhole curve, a hip curve, a straight edge all in one. As you can see, that it's plastic and clear. The downside to this ruler is that it can break, and as you can see, I have a breakage in the ruler here, but I like it because it's clear and I can see through my projects. There are metal kinds as well, but the metal, you just can't see through it, but it does last longer. Also, you're going to need a plastic clear straight ruler. This straight ruler is very essential for marking your 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can see through your work with this plastic ruler, and it does last long, and I do highly recommend it. Scotch tape, measuring tape, and this is a marker to mark your patterns whenever you're going to transfer it onto paper or onto fabric. I usually use this marker to help me. You can also use a marking chalk. I use it in my tutorials. If you have watched my YouTube videos, you'll see a marking chalk. I highly recommend you to have an iron to press your garments, your seam allowances, because this is also going to determine how well your garment is made by the way it's pressed. Bubbly hems, bubbly side seams, garments that's not properly pressed can make your garment look poorly constructed. So you want to make sure that you have an iron to press once you've completed your projects. Here I have a chiffon that I stitched, and as you can see, it was wrinkly before, and then I'm going to press it now. Makes your project look more respectable and more professional. So I highly recommend you having an iron when you are working with your projects. This is pattern paper. Pattern paper is used to create your patterns, or whenever you are going to adjust your patterns or going to do the slash method. I have brown paper and I have regular pattern paper where it is markings on the pattern paper per inch. And this pattern paper helps me adjust my patterns and lay them on the straight grain, and I can mark them on my pattern paper. It also tells me the width of my pattern and how long I want it and how to keep it straight on the edge. It's very useful, and as you can see, the pattern paper is 1 inch per inch, but on a diagonal is about 1.5 inches. So it's very good, it's very accurate, and it helps you with your patterns and keep it very accurate on the sizing and the placements. Brown paper, I use it for whenever I'm making my adjustments or I'm doing the slash method. I just tend to use the pattern paper just to adjust. But if you don't have the one that has the markings, the brown paper is just as fine. It's just going to be a little bit difficult when it comes to sizing and placement, but you'll be fine with it if you just have the brown paper. Here I'm going to give you a demonstration on how to sew a straight stitch, and here I have a piece of satin fabric file, and at the edge of my fabric is very straight and clean, as you can see, and I'm going to align them up at the edge. Now there's a grid on your foot pedal area of your machine, which is for you to use as a guide. It's also used for sizing as well, for you to determine how far apart your seam allowance is, 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 1/4 inch, and this is a guide for you to determine the width of it. So here I have it all lined up. I'm going to use the guide as a guide to guide me when I'm stitching, and I'm going to look at the edge and hold my fabric when I'm start stitching. This will allow me to control the fabric and the stitch will be straight. So here, as you can see, the stitch is straight. It's very parallel to the edge of the fabric, and once again, like I said, your edge has to be very clean when it's cut, so that way you can have it even and straight. That is the goal when you are stitching. When you have a edge that is jagged, your stitch will become jagged because you are following the edge. So make sure that your edge is clean. Here I'm showing you again, this is a Ponte fabric. I changed the needle size for knit, and I'm doing a zigzag stitch, and it's a 1/2 inch stitch, and I placed it against the edge of the grid and did a zigzag stitch, as you can see. So here it is, parallel to the edge, and the edge is very straight and neat. Here I changed the needle size. It's organza. This is very lightweight. Again, I'm putting my edge against the edge of the grid and watching it and also guiding it down as I stitch it, and you can see that it's straight again and very parallel to the edge of the fabric. Here I have chiffon. I changed the needle size, and here again it's parallel to the grid, and I'm watching it and guiding it and taking my time, and as you can see, the stitch is straight and parallel to the edge. Here's an embroidery. lace fabric. I changed the needle to a heavy duty needle because of the embroidery. Depending on the lace that you have, if it have a lot of work on it, you may need to go a little heavier. And again, once my edge is clean, I just basically put it against the grid and then guide the fabric with my hands as I'm sewing. And here, as you can see, the stitch is straight. Here is sequence fabric, and as you can see, the sequence is very dense. There's a lot of sequence here. It's on mesh. So I'm going to use a heavy duty needle, and I'm going to again make sure the edge is straight and use the guide plate to guide me for my seam allowance. And then I'm going to use my hands to guide the stitches when I'm sewing. And once again, it is parallel to the edge of the fabric. Here is the outside of what the sequence look. Here is spandex swimwear fabric, and again I'm just going to fold it and make sure the edge is very straight, and I'm going to place it against the grid so I can see how far down. I'm going to use a zigzag stitch and guide my fabric as well when I'm stitching. A zigzag stitch should be used along the fabric that is stretched. Some fabrics stretch one way and the other way doesn't stretch, so you want to make sure your zigzag is going in the same direction of the stretch, so that way the fabric can continue to stretch. If you sew a straight stitch on a stretched fabric, it will not stretch and the thread will start popping. So here I have stretched velvet, and as you can see that the velvet is stretchy, and I'm doing a zigzag stitch. I use the grid to guide me as well, and I guide it with my hands. And here is the zigzag stitch once complete, and as you can see I'm stretching it, and it stretches with the fabric. And that is all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or feedback, please leave them down below. So I will see you guys in the next video. Bye guys.